Welcome to this story, one of the most unsettling cases ever noted in the Missouri Ozarks. Before we dive in, share in the comments where you're tuning in from and the exact time you started listening. It's always interesting to see the different places and hours of the day or night where these stories reach. In the autumn of 1890, the Ozark Mountains settled into their quieter season. The forests thickened with shadow as leaves fell, and the narrow hollows between ridges filled with damp air and isolation. County travel logs from Shannon and Douglas counties describe the region as sparsely governed, a place where law traveled slowly, and men often lived by their own codes. It was during this period that a trapper known locally as Isaac Rook began appearing along the Current River. He arrived without announcement, hauling heavy packs of pelts into small trading posts, always alone, always careful about where he camped. According to store ledgers, his furs were unusually well preserved, soft, cleanly cut, and prepared with a precision that exceeded most frontier standards. At first, nothing seemed amiss. Rook claimed to have learned his trade farther north, along older river systems where winters were harsher and animals scarcer. He spoke little, paid in coin rather than barter, and avoided town gatherings. A general store clerk later recalled, "He had the look of a man measuring everything twice, even people." The Ozarks were no strangers to violence in those years. Vigilante justice had left its mark on the region only a few years earlier, when groups like the Bald Knobbers had operated in nearby counties, enforcing their own version of order under the cover of night. Though officially disbanded by 1890, their legacy lingered, quiet, suspicious, and watchful. Within weeks of Rook's arrival, whispers began to circulate. Hunters reported finding abandoned camps deep in the timber, fires cold, traps still set, bedrolls neatly folded. One man, Caleb Turner, was last seen heading upriver to check his lines. He never returned. His rifle was found leaning against a tree, clean and unloaded. No blood was found. No signs of struggle. Rook continued trapping. By early winter, traders noticed something else. Among the usual deer, fox, and beaver pelts were hides that defied easy classification. They were thin, oddly elastic, and bore faint markings that some dismissed as damage from poor curing. One buyer, according to a later affidavit, refused to handle them, saying only, "That ain't from anything that walks on four legs." Still, no accusations were made. In the Ozarks, suspicion alone was rarely enough to act, and so the trapper with the heavy packs remained, moving silently through a region already accustomed to unanswered disappearances, unaware perhaps or unconcerned that eyes had begun to follow him. The first formal complaint would not be filed until the snow came. The first official notice came not from a sheriff, but from a schoolteacher. In January of 1891, Miss Eleanor Pike, recently assigned to a rural schoolhouse near Alley Spring, wrote a letter to the county clerk describing the unexplained absence of two older boys who had stopped attending lessons shortly after Christmas. Both were known to help their families with winter trapping. Both were last seen heading into the timber along routes Isaac Rook was known to frequent. The clerk, Harlan M. Fitch, logged the letter without comment. In his register, he marked the matter as likely seasonal relocation. It was a common explanation, and one that required no further action, yet the disappearances continued. A month later, a preacher traveling between settlements reported finding a campsite in remarkable condition, canvas intact, cookware cleaned and stacked, boots lined carefully beside a stump. There were no footprints leading away. In his journal, the preacher wrote, "It was as if the men stood up and stepped out of the world." The entry was dated February 3, 1891. County deputies were finally dispatched in March, prompted less by concern for the missing than by pressure from families who had begun comparing notes. Sheriff William C. Hodge questioned traders, ferrymen, and hunters. Rook's name surfaced repeatedly, not as an accusation but as a constant presence. He had been seen near every route where someone failed to return. When questioned, Rook was cooperative. He produced licenses, receipts, and a quiet confidence that unsettled those who spoke with him. According to Hodges' report, Rook stated simply that men disappear in the Ozarks all the time, and that trapping was a solitary business by nature. The sheriff noted no cause for arrest. What drew greater attention were the Pelts themselves. A fur buyer in Van Buren County sent a letter warning that several hides sold under Rook's name were unsuitable for resale, and unlike any known game. The letter referenced irregular pore patterns and unusual stretch, details that suggested human skin without ever stating it outright. Dr. Nathaniel Crowson, a physician with experience in battlefield injuries, was asked to examine one of the hides discreetly. His written opinion was cautious. He described the material as mammalian, expertly cured, but added a troubling line at the end. The method of removal suggests anatomical familiarity. That sentence was underlined twice in the file. Rumors spread faster than records. Some claimed Rook harvested the dead after accidents. Others whispered of an old practice, taking trophies to ward off evil or settle debts. A few invoked lingering violence from years past, suggesting the mountains had never truly quieted after the era of masked night riders and vigilantes like the Bald Knobbers, whose methods blurred justice and brutality. Rook, for his part, began moving camp more frequently. By the time deputies returned with intent to search his trapping grounds, they found only ash and impressions in the soil where a tent had stood. No tools, no pelts, no journals. Just one thing remained, a stretched hide nailed briefly to a tree and then removed, leaving behind a faint outline darker than the bark around it. No one could say how long it had been there, and no one could say whose skin it had been. The investigation shifted its tone after that. What had been treated as a matter of missing persons now carried the careful language of something worse, though no one in authority was willing to name it outright. Sheriff Hodge requested assistance from neighboring counties, and for the first time, sworn affidavits were taken rather than casual statements. One such affidavit came from Jonah Mercer, a hunter who claimed to have shared a trading fire with Rook weeks earlier. Mercer described the trapper as methodical to the point of discomfort. He cleaned his knives longer than needed, Mercer said. Not sharpening, cleaning. When asked what kind of knives, Mercer hesitated before answering. Long-bladed skinning tools, well-balanced, worn smooth at the handle as if used daily. Mercer also recalled seeing a roll of hides bundled separately from the rest. These were thinner, paler, and kept wrapped even in dry weather. When Mercer joked that Rook must have found a strange breed of deer, Rook reportedly replied, "All hides come from something that walked once." The remark was laughed off at the time. In April of 1891, deputies located what they believed to be one of Rook's earlier camps along a limestone bluff overlooking the river. The site had been carefully abandoned. Fire stones were scrubbed. Blood traces were absent. Yet the ground nearby showed repeated disturbance, shallow and precise, as though something had been buried temporarily and then removed. Among the debris was a fragment of ledger paper, too damaged to read fully. Only 3 words were legible: prime, winter, and male. No animals were listed. Dr. Crowson was called again. His private notes, later recovered among his personal effects, suggest he had reached a conclusion he dared not formalize. He wrote, "If these are what I believe, then the intent was not murder for rage or profit. It was harvesting." That distinction troubled him more than the act itself. As spring deepened, reports came in from farther afield. A ferry operator in Oregon County described a man matching Rook's appearance crossing alone at dawn, hauling packs too heavy for furs alone. A deputy followed the trail for 2 days before losing it in the hills. Newspaper coverage remained sparse. Editors chose phrasing like suspected irregular trapping practices and unlicensed hides. No mention was made of human remains. Perhaps no one wished to be the first to put it into print. Meanwhile, families of the missing began to speak less of rescue and more of recovery. One mother asked the sheriff, "If my boy is gone, can I at least have what's left of him?" There was no answer recorded. By summer, Isaac Rook had vanished as thoroughly as those suspected to have crossed his path. No arrest was made. No warrant served. His name was entered into regional notices under a dozen possible aliases, none confirmed. What remained were the hides already sold, some burned quietly, others lost to storage fires, a few locked away and never examined again. And in the Ozarks, where people understood when not to ask questions too loudly, the forests closed back over the paths he had used, leaving behind only the uneasy knowledge that someone had learned the mountains too well. By late summer, the case existed in fragments rather than facts. Sheriff Hodge assembled what remained into a single file: affidavits, letters, a few damaged ledger scraps, and Dr. Croson's cautious notes. It was thin, but heavier than it looked. The weight came from implication. Attention turned to where Rook might have learned his methods. County records showed no apprenticeship, no family ties to known trappers in the region. His name appeared nowhere before 1890. This absence prompted a quiet theory among deputies that Rook was not new to the trade, only new to the Ozarks. He had arrived already practiced. A clue surfaced in an unrelated probate dispute. While reviewing old court dockets, Clerk Fitch noticed a reference to a man using a similar description, tall, narrow-shouldered with a scar along the left hand, who had testified years earlier in Taney County regarding illegal hide trading. The name given then was different. The behavior was not. The case had been dropped after witnesses recanted. Fitch added a note to the margin: possible continuity. In September, a search party followed reports of a foul odor near a sinkhole west of Eminence. What they found was not a body but refuse, discarded flesh scraps, carefully trimmed, left where scavengers had already done their work. Dr. Croson examined what remained and confirmed they were human. The cuts were clean. The bones showed no signs of struggle. He wrote only one sentence in the official report: cause of death undetermined, post-mortem processing evident. That report never reached the newspapers. Instead, the sheriff requested assistance from a state marshal, who arrived with 2 men and a mandate to determine whether a serial crime existed. Their presence unsettled locals. Old memories stirred, of masked men enforcing order with ropes and silence decades earlier. Though no one said it openly, comparisons were made to the era when the bald knobbers had roamed nearby hills, deciding guilt privately and leaving bodies as warnings. The thought that something similar might be happening again, quietly and without masks, made people uneasy. The marshal concluded his visit abruptly. In his final note, he wrote that without a suspect in custody, no charges could be pursued. He advised increased patrols and discretion. Discretion was followed. By winter, the disappearances slowed. Whether this was due to caution, coincidence, or something else entirely was never determined. Hunters traveled in pairs. Camps were set closer to settlements. The forests felt watched in a way that discouraged solitude. Then in December of 1891, a trapper found something folded neatly beside his fire while he slept: a cured hide, small and pale, wrapped in oilcloth. No note accompanied it. The man burned it without telling anyone. He would later admit under oath that the texture had been unmistakable. No further pelts appeared that season. Isaac Rook was never seen again in Missouri. Some claimed sightings in Arkansas. Others swore he'd gone north. A few believed he never left the Ozarks at all, only changed the way he moved through them. And in the absence of answers, the case hardened into something else, not a solved crime, but a lesson quietly absorbed, that in certain places men could vanish not because no one looked for them, but because someone knew exactly how to erase them. As winter deepened into early 1892, the Ozarks closed ranks. Snow limited travel and the hills became their own barriers. What investigation remained shifted from pursuit to preservation, of records, of testimony, of a fragile consensus that whatever had happened should be contained rather than inflamed. Sheriff Hodge instructed deputies to revisit earlier sites with fresh eyes, not to search for bodies. There was little expectation of that, but to document patterns. Camps abandoned without haste, tools cleaned beyond necessity, earth disturbed and returned to place. These observations were logged with care, stripped of speculation. The file grew thicker, though no clearer. One new statement came from Luther Kincaid, a tanner whose family had worked hides for generations. Kincaid had refused Rook's business the previous year and now explained why. He testified that the Pelts Rook brought him showed grain alignment inconsistent with game, and that the hair follicles, where present, were too sparse, too evenly spaced. It felt wrong under the blade, Kincaid said, like cutting something that remembers. The phrase was struck from the official transcript, replaced with unsuitable for trade. In February, a small ledger surfaced in the possession of a river trader who claimed to have bought it from a man matching Rook's description months earlier. The book contained tally marks and brief descriptors: age, season, condition. No names, no prices. The last page had been torn out. Dr. Croson reviewed the entries and noted that the numbers did not correspond to animal yields. He declined to elaborate further. Midway through the winter, the state marshal returned unannounced, this time with instructions to assess public risk. His notes, later found among county papers, suggest frustration. No spectacle, no confessions, no bodies, he wrote. Only implications. Difficult to prosecute a method. He recommended closing the inquiry unless new evidence emerged. The recommendation was accepted. By spring, people spoke of Rook less often, and when they did, it was with a precision that avoided myth. He was not called a monster, he was called a trapper. The distinction mattered. Monsters were imagined, trappers were practical. The fear lay in what practicality could justify. A final incident occurred in May. A boy gathering firewood found a shallow pit near a creek bank, recently filled. Inside were scraps of oilcloth and twine, cut cleanly and arranged as if catalogued. No flesh remained. The site was photographed, then quietly collapsed. The photographs were stored and later misplaced. As the season turned, disappearances ceased. Whether this was due to vigilance, migration, or something else entirely remained unresolved. The forests resumed their ordinary dangers. Men returned home, trade normalized. Yet the case did not end so much as it settled. It became a reference point used obliquely. When a hunter failed to return in later years, someone would say, "Not like before." Everyone understood what that meant. And somewhere beyond the logged roads and marked trails, the Ozarks kept their silence, dense, attentive, and uninclined to clarify whether Isaac Rook had left them behind, or whether he had simply learned to take less with him. In the years that followed, the file labeled Rook did not close. It thinned. Pages were removed for copying and never returned. Statements were summarized, then replaced by summaries of summaries. By 1894, the case existed less as evidence and more as institutional memory, known to clerks and deputies who had inherited it rather than worked it. One such deputy, Arthur Bellows, added a brief memorandum after reviewing the materials. He noted that Rook's movements, reconstructed from ferry logs and store ledgers, suggested an intentional pattern: short stays near isolated crossings, followed by longer absences deeper in the timber. Bellows wrote, He did not trap where animals were plentiful. He trapped where men were alone. The line was never sighted again. Bellows also flagged an overlooked detail. Several of the missing had prior involvement in disputes, land disagreements, unpaid debts, accusations never proven. This raised an uncomfortable possibility that Rook selected targets not randomly, but for reasons invisible to the law. The memo stopped short of naming motive. Instead, it asked whether the mountains themselves functioned as a kind of court, absorbing outcomes without record. That idea found no official support. Still, it circulated quietly among those who read the file. In 1896, a small fire damaged the record's room after hours. The blaze was contained quickly, but smoke and water destroyed a number of documents. Among them were photographs taken at the creek bank pit and several affidavits naming the same routes repeatedly. No investigation into the fire's cause appears in the surviving minutes. Around this time, a professor from Springfield, Edgar Linthwaite, requested access while researching post-Civil War vigilantism in the Ozarks. He believed Rook's case reflected a later evolution of older traditions, private enforcement, quiet removal, echoes of practices seen during the Bald Knobber years, when masked men imposed order without trial. Linthwaite was careful not to equate the two, noting that Rook acted alone and without spectacle. The similarity, he wrote, lies in method, not organization. Linthwaite's paper was never published. Meanwhile, stories adjusted. In some tellings, Rook skinned men alive. In others, he found them dead. The official file rejected both extremes. What remained consistent were the objects: oilcloth, twine, knives cleaned to dullness, hides cured too well. The consistency suggested practice, not impulse. By the turn of the century, the Ozarks had changed. Rail lines edged closer. Timber operations expanded. With more people came fewer isolated camps. Disappearances did not stop entirely, but they lost their earlier pattern. No unusual pelts appeared in trade. No neatly abandoned camps surfaced. Yet among older trappers, one rule endured: never accept hides from a man who wouldn't say where he camped, and never follow someone into the hills without knowing how you'd leave. The land, for its part, kept no markers, and if Isaac Rook still moved through those forests, he did so without trace, leaving behind only the uneasy understanding that someone, at least once, had learned to turn men into commodities, and to do it so quietly that the mountains themselves seemed to assist. By 1898, the Ozarks had entered a period of uneasy adjustment. Timber camps multiplied, bringing noise and numbers where once there had been long stretches of solitude. Ironically, this expansion made the earlier disappearances feel more remote, as though they belonged to a different landscape altogether. Yet the men who had trapped those hills before the saws arrived did not forget. One such man, Hosea Dern, provided a late statement after a chance encounter reignited his memory. Dern claimed that in the winter of 1891, he had followed Rook at a distance for nearly half a day, driven not by suspicion but by instinct. He described Rook's movements as deliberate and economical, avoiding obvious game trails and instead favoring routes men used when they believed no one was watching. Dern eventually lost sight of him near a limestone ravine. What lingered was the sound. No animals, he said, just tools, like a man working slowly so he wouldn't have to work twice. Dern never went back to that ravine. When asked why he waited years to speak, he answered simply, "Because nothing asked me to remember until then." County newspapers briefly revisited the case after a tanner in Texas was arrested for illegal trade involving human remains taken from graveyards. Editors were careful to stress that the crimes were unrelated. Still, the article stirred old fears. Letters arrived at the sheriff's office asking whether Rook had ever been caught. The standard reply was issued: no suspect in custody, no charges filed. Behind closed doors, deputies acknowledged something different. The Rook file was not unsolved. It was unfinished. There was a sense that the story lacked its final motion, its necessary ending. That absence unsettled them more than any grisly detail might have. Around the same time, an elderly ferryman swore he had seen Rook again, older, thinner, traveling without packs. The sighting occurred near the Arkansas border. When questioned, the ferryman admitted he did not speak to the man. Didn't seem like someone who needed company, he said. No follow-up was possible. By the end of the decade, the Ozarks had begun to absorb the case into folklore. Children were warned of a man who skinned liars. Others spoke of a trapper who collected debts in flesh. Adults corrected these tales quietly, insisting the truth was less theatrical and therefore more dangerous. The official stance never changed. Without bodies, without confession, without a man to hang the crime upon, the law could only record what had been observed. And what had been observed was precision, patience, and an absence of chaos. In places where justice moved slowly, order sometimes found other paths. The Hills did not speak of Isaac Rook again that year, but they did not forget the routes he used. The first tangible discovery came not from pursuit, but from accident. In the spring of 1899, a timber crew clearing brush near a seasonal camp uncovered a shallow earthen cut concealed by leaf rot and limestone fragments. At first glance it appeared natural, a sink where rainwater pooled. Only when a shovel struck oiled fabric did the men stop work. What lay beneath was not a grave. The pit held no bodies, no bones, nothing that could be catalogued cleanly. Instead, it contained tools, skinning knives wrapped in cloth, their blades dulled by careful maintenance rather than neglect. There were wooden stretching frames, small and narrow, stacked neatly, and there were scraps of cured hide folded with the same care one might give legal documents. Most had degraded beyond identification. One had not. Dr. Crowson was dead by then, but his notes had been inherited by Dr. Samuel Ireton, a younger physician with training in anatomy. Ireton examined the remaining fragment privately. His conclusion, written in restrained language, stated that the dermal thickness and pore structure were consistent with adult human tissue. He added that the curing process showed no haste. This was done by someone who expected time, he wrote. The site yielded no personal items, no buttons, no coins, no remnants of clothing. Whatever had been taken from men had been reduced to material alone. Sheriff Hodge ordered the pit filled and the tools removed. No inventory was published. Some items were destroyed. Others disappeared into private custody, unrecorded. The discovery stirred quiet panic. Families whose sons had vanished years earlier came forward again, hoping this might finally anchor grief to fact. But the pit offered no names, no timelines, no certainty. It was evidence without identity. In the days that followed, old comparisons resurfaced. A former deputy remarked that the concealment reminded him of how vigilante groups once operated, swift, deliberate, leaving just enough behind to discourage inquiry. He did not name them, but others did. The memory of the bald knobbers, still close enough to sting, colored the discussion. The difference, many noted, was scale. Those men had sought spectacle. Rook, if he was responsible, had sought none. Within weeks, the pit site was overrun by new logging activity. The ground changed. Landmarks vanished. The exact location was soon disputed. Some claimed it had never existed at all. A final note was added to the file by Deputy Bellows. Evidence suggests a fixed processing location used temporarily and abandoned without error. He underlined without error twice. After that, official interest waned again. No warrant could be issued for a man no one could find, tied to acts no one could legally define. The law requires edges, dates, victims, acts. What Rook left behind resisted edges. By autumn, the Ozarks returned to their routines. Timber camps moved on, trappers adjusted routes. The hills absorbed the disturbance. Yet among those who had seen the pit, one belief settled in, that the most disturbing thing was not what had been done there, but how cleanly it had ended. No panic, no interruption, just a finished task, sealed and left behind. And somewhere beyond the mapped roads, the forests kept the rest. After the pit was filled and the tools removed, an unspoken agreement settled over the county offices. Nothing more would be extracted from the ground unless something new forced their hand. The Ozarks had a way of swallowing disturbances, and by the winter of 1899, the disturbance had gone quiet again. What followed instead were sightings, imprecise, contradictory, and therefore difficult to dismiss entirely. A rail hand claimed to have seen a solitary figure moving parallel to the tracks at dawn, keeping pace without ever approaching. A storekeeper near the Arkansas line recalled a man purchasing oilcloth and twine, paying in small coins worn nearly smooth. Each description resembled Isaac Rook, but none were close enough to confirm. Deputy Bellows attempted to compile these reports into a coherent path. He failed. The sightings did not form a line so much as a scatter, as though whoever was being seen understood how to remain adjacent to attention without entering it. Bellows wrote, "If he is traveling, it is without destination. If he is hiding, it is in plain country." Yes. Meanwhile, the hides already sold continued to trouble those who had handled them. A tanner in St. Louis returned a bundle to its sender without explanation. Another burned his entire stock after discovering two pieces that did not behave like animal leather when soaked. No charges were filed. No names were attached. In early 1900, a county judge ordered a quiet review of older disappearance cases along river corridors. Several matched the same profile: solitary men, no witnesses, personal effects left behind with care. The judge stopped short of linking them formally to Rook, noting only that the pattern predated his arrival and outlasted his departure. "This may not be a man," he wrote in a margin, "but a method adopted by one." Yes. That idea unsettled more than the notion of a single killer ever had. A local historian, compiling notes on post-war violence in southern Missouri, suggested that the region had long cultivated a preference for private solutions. He cited the era of masked enforcement in the hills, without naming them directly, as proof that some communities trusted removal over trial. The reference to the bald knobbers surfaced again in conversation, not as an accusation, but as a reminder of what order could look like when practiced quietly. By the end of the year, the Rook file was officially marked inactive. The designation did not imply resolution, only dormancy. The documents were boxed and moved to storage. Access required written permission. Few requested it. Yet among trappers, a new custom took hold. Men began marking their camps with small, personal signs, carved initials, hung tools, folded cloth, signals meant for other men rather than animals. No one said why. Everyone understood. The forests themselves showed no sign of what had passed through them. Trails shifted. Campsites vanished. Timber reshaped the land. But in certain hollows, hunters still reported an odd sense of completion, as if something once done there had been finished correctly and would not be repeated. Whether Isaac Rook still lived, whether he had died, or whether he had simply become unnecessary remained unanswered. What mattered was that the Ozarks had learned how easily a man could be reduced to material, and how carefully that material could be carried away. The new century arrived quietly in the Ozarks. There were no celebrations recorded in the county minutes, no mention of change beyond the routine turning of pages. Yet for those who remembered the Rook years, the shift carried an unspoken tension. Time had moved forward, but nothing had settled. In 1901, a letter reached the sheriff's office from a trading post in northern Arkansas. It described a man offering hides unsuitable for classification, cured with uncommon skill. The writer did not accuse. He asked only whether such trade had ever been a concern farther north. The letter was read, copied, and filed. No reply was sent. Deputy Bellows, nearing retirement, added a final annotation to the Rook file after reviewing the letter. "If the practice continues," he wrote, "then the practitioner has outlived the attention given to him." The line suggested resignation rather than fear. That same year, a flood exposed portions of the riverbank long untouched. Among the debris were fragments of oilcloth and twine lodged beneath driftwood. No flesh remained. No tools were nearby. A younger deputy photographed the site, then followed orders to leave it undisturbed. The photographs later faded, their details lost to chemical damage. Meanwhile, memory softened. New residents dismissed older warnings as exaggeration. The hills felt no more dangerous than any other frontier, yet experienced trappers continued to travel in pairs, especially in winter. When asked why, one answered, "For company." He did not say protection. A professor from Columbia visited briefly in 1904, studying regional crime patterns. After reviewing the Rook materials, he concluded that the case demonstrated an unusual restraint. "Most crimes seek notice," he wrote. "This one sought completion." He referenced earlier eras of extralegal order in the Ozarks, again drawing quiet parallels to the vigilante traditions that had once shaped the region. His paper was rejected for publication. As years passed, the name Isaac Rook appeared less often, replaced by euphemism. The trapper, the skinner, that business. The avoidance felt deliberate. Names fix things. This story resisted being fixed. By 1908, the Ozarks had changed enough that Rook's methods, if continued, would have been difficult to repeat. Fewer isolated men, more movement, more witnesses. Perhaps the land itself had become less accommodating, or perhaps the method had adapted. In the end, no confession emerged. No body was ever identified. No trial convened. The law closed its hands around nothing and called it finished. But the mountains did not. They kept the roots, the silence, and the knowledge that someone had once learned how to harvest men without leaving a mess, and had done so well enough that even memory struggled to hold him in place. By the second decade of the century, the Rook case had passed into a category county clerks referred to as dormant but sensitive. It was no longer requested by name, only by implication. When someone asked to review the old Ozark disappearances, the box was retrieved without further clarification. In 1911, Judge Clarence Whitlow ordered a limited audit of unresolved cases while reorganizing the courthouse archives. His concern was administrative, not investigative. Yet when he reached the Rook materials, he paused. The file was thinner than expected. Several affidavits referenced exhibits that no longer existed. One physician's note mentioned comparative tissue analysis, though no samples were logged. Whitlow remarked in a memo, "This record appears to have been curated rather than preserved." The phrase was never explained. That same year, a forest ranger newly assigned to the region reported finding a line of old trap sites arranged with unusual regularity, each placed exactly a day's walk apart. The ranger, unfamiliar with local history, assumed it efficient planning. Older men recognized it differently. The spacing matched Rook's reconstructed movements almost exactly. No one informed the ranger. In 1913, a hunter named Matthew Kells vanished after entering the hills alone despite warnings. His camp was found intact 3 days later. Food remained. Traps were unset but cleaned. His boots were placed side by side at the edge of the clearing, toes pointed inward. No tracks led away. The sheriff ruled it an accident. Privately, Bellows, now retired, wrote to a former colleague that the arrangement was too considerate to be chance. He died later that year, taking with him the last first-hand understanding of how deliberate the earlier signs had been. Public interest never followed. Newspapers gave Kells a single paragraph. Timber companies continued expanding. The Ozarks grew louder, busier, and less hospitable to solitude. And yet the pattern had repeated, muted, efficient, unresolved. A local teacher later observed that the mountains no longer needed secrecy. Too many people passed through. Too many eyes. If the practice had continued, it would have required adaptation beyond recognition. Whether Isaac Rook was still alive at this point was unknown. Some believed he had died years earlier, perhaps alone, perhaps as carefully as he had lived. Others believed the name had never mattered, that the method had simply been learned once and then set aside when it no longer fit the land. The final notation in the file, dated 1915, reads only, "No further activity consistent with prior pattern." It is written in a hand not matched to any known clerk. After that, the box was sealed and shelved. And in the Missouri Ozarks, where the forests had once allowed a man to be reduced to hide in silence, the trails shifted again, leaving behind only the quiet certainty that some crimes end not when they are solved, but when they can no longer be repeated. What remained after 1915 was not evidence, but behavior. Men who had never read the Rook file still acted as though they had. Camps were left marked. Routes were shared openly. Solitude became a choice made carefully, not casually. The Ozarks adjusted in ways that never required explanation. In 1916, a surveyor named Thomas Elbridge submitted a routine report noting irregular ground compaction along a narrow hollow west of the current river. His language was technical, soil density inconsistent with erosion, signs of repeated disturbance followed by deliberate leveling. The report was accepted and filed. No follow-up was ordered. An older clerk later remarked that the hollow had always settled strange. That winter, a pair of trappers argued publicly over a stretch of timber. The dispute ended abruptly when one man withdrew without explanation, abandoning a season's worth of traps. Asked why, he said only that the place felt used. The phrasing drew quiet recognition from those nearby. In early 1917, Judge Whitlow received a letter from a colleague in Arkansas describing an inquiry into illicit trade goods that never reached indictment. The letter mentioned hides that failed inspection for reasons best left undescribed. Whitlow read it twice and then placed it in the Rook box without annotation. No reply was sent. The borders between states had never mattered much to the Hills. Around this time, a local folklorist attempted to formalize the stories circulating among trappers and timber hands. His notes describe a figure who took only what could be carried and carried it as if it were lawful. He rejected supernatural explanations, insisting the fear came from order, not chaos. The folklorist compared the restraint to older patterns of extralegal control in the region, again echoing the quiet legacy of the bald knobbers, men who had once enforced their will without spectacle and then dissolved back into the land. The comparison was noted and set aside. In the spring, a small landslide exposed a length of oilcloth and a rusted buckle near a creek bend. Children found it first and were told to leave it where it lay. By the time a deputy arrived, the slide had shifted again, covering the spot. No attempt was made to recover the item. The deputy logged the visit as terrain instability. By summer, the Ozarks were loud with work. Saws, wagons, voices. Whatever had once thrived on isolation found fewer opportunities. If the method had required quiet, it had lost its advantage. And yet unease persisted in subtler ways. Men spoke of certain hollows as finished. Not dangerous, not cursed, simply concluded, places where nothing more was expected to happen. The Rook file remained sealed. The box grew dusty. New clerks learned where it was without being told why. Because in the Missouri Ozarks, understanding did not depend on answers, it depended on recognition. And recognition, once learned, did not require repetition. The mountains had been taught something once. They had not asked to be taught again. By the late 1910s, the case had reached the edge of its natural life. There were no living witnesses left who could speak from direct involvement, only those who had inherited caution as a habit. The Ozarks, reshaped by timber and traffic, no longer resembled the terrain that had once allowed a man like Rook to move unseen. Still, traces surfaced when least expected. In 1918, during a county-wide inventory of confiscated goods, a clerk uncovered a sealed parcel wrapped in oilcloth, misfiled among obsolete warrants. Inside were two small leather pieces, expertly cured and stitched together at the edge, as if once part of a larger whole. No label identified their origin. A penciled note inside the package read only, "Unclaimed, not for sale." The clerk resealed the parcel and returned it to storage without recording its contents. That same year, a physician treating a logging injury remarked privately that certain scars he had seen on older men matched descriptions from Dr. Croson's earlier notes, clean, deliberate marks that healed evenly. When asked how such injuries were sustained, the men gave no answers. They did not appear embarrassed or afraid, only closed. A short article appeared in a Springfield paper revisiting the era of frontier vigilantism, tracing how communities once handled perceived threats without courts or juries. Though the article focused on known groups and named incidents, readers in the Ozarks recognized familiar language: efficiency, containment, removal. The Rook matter was not mentioned, but it did not need to be. The land itself continued to resist interference. A road project proposed near one of the older hollows was abandoned after repeated collapses. Engineers cited unstable limestone. Locals cited nothing at all. In 1919, the final year any material related to the case was added, Judge Whitlow penned a short reflection while retiring his files. "This record demonstrates the limits of law," he wrote, "not because wrongdoing escaped it, but because wrongdoing was never framed in terms the law could accept." The reflection was placed at the back of the box and never cited again. After that, silence returned, not the heavy silence of fear, but the lighter silence of closure without understanding. People no longer spoke of the trapper. Younger men had never heard the name. Yet when someone camped alone too long, others still checked on him. When a camp stood abandoned, it was approached carefully. No one said why. And though the Missouri Ozarks had grown louder with industry and movement, certain places remained untouched, as if marked by consensus rather than warning. Places where the ground had once been used, places where something had been finished, and places where no one expected anything else to happen again. What survived into the 1920s was not the story itself, but its outline. The details blurred, yet the shape remained unmistakable. Older residents spoke of the case as though it had edges they could still feel, even if the center had gone hollow. In 1920, a forestry inspector named Walter Himes submitted a routine assessment of restricted hunting zones. In his report, he noted a narrow corridor where game populations behaved unusually. Deer avoided it, smaller animals crossed it quickly, and predators circled without entering. Himes attributed this to scent patterns or human disturbance. An older ranger later annotated the margin, "Always been that way." No further explanation was added. That same year, a former tanner testified in an unrelated fraud case that he had once learned to identify false pelts by touch alone. Under questioning, he admitted the skill came from handling hides he wished he had never been paid to examine. When pressed, he refused to elaborate, stating only, "They were too careful to be accidents." The court did not pursue the line of questioning. In local memory, Isaac Rook had ceased to be a person and become a reference point. When someone was overly methodical, they were said to work like the trapper. When a place was avoided without clear reason, it was said to be old business. These phrases passed without reaction, understood only by those who had inherited their meaning. A traveling lecturer once asked why the Ozarks seemed resistant to sensational crime stories compared to other regions. A local editor replied, "Because we learned early that spectacle isn't the danger, order is." The remark was never printed. No new evidence surfaced. No remains were identified. The hides discovered years earlier had either degraded or vanished into private hands, their origins unprovable. The law, having exhausted its tools, accepted the silence. And yet the land did not erase everything. Hunters continued to report certain hollows where sound carried poorly, where firelight felt unwelcome, where men spoke less without knowing why. These places were not feared, they were respected. By then the case had achieved a rare status, unresolved, undocumented, and yet complete in its consequences. Nothing more was expected of it, nothing more was demanded. The Missouri Ozarks had absorbed the lesson quietly, and they did not ask for it again. By the middle of the 1920s, the landscape itself had become the final archivist. Timber cuts erased campsites. Floods altered creek banks. What had once been clear paths dissolved into brush and limestone. Anyone arriving new to the Ozarks would have found it impossible to trace where the Rook story had unfolded, even if they had known to look. Yet small, stubborn details endured. In 1924, a state survey attempted to reconcile older land deeds with updated maps. One parcel along a narrow hollow repeatedly failed to register clean boundaries. Markers placed there shifted after rain. Stakes loosened without disturbance. The surveyor wrote that the ground behaved as if it resisted ownership. The note was accepted without challenge. An elderly trapper, questioned during the survey, remarked that the hollow had already been worked. When asked by whom, he answered, "By someone who finished." The surveyor did not record the exchange. That same year, a school assignment prompted children to interview elders about local history. One paper, preserved only because it was misfiled among court transcripts, recounts a conversation with a woman who claimed her brother vanished trapping in the early 1890s. The child asked what happened to him. The woman replied, "He was taken apart." No elaboration followed. The teacher graded the paper poorly and moved on. In public, the story no longer circulated. Privately, the rules remained intact. Camps were not left unmarked. Solitary trapping fell out of favor. Men spoke openly about routes and plans. The Ozarks had adapted without ever admitting what had prompted the adaptation. Occasionally, outsiders attempted to revisit the old rumors. A journalist from Kansas City arrived in 1927 seeking material for a regional crime piece. He was met with politeness and empty answers. He stayed 3 days and left with nothing. In his unpublished notes, later found among his effects, he wrote, "The story is not denied. It is simply unavailable." No one spoke Isaac Rook's name to him. By then, even the Rook file had lost its gravity. It existed physically but not practically. Clerks knew where it was, yet could not say why. Judges remembered reading it but not what they had learned. The absence of conclusion had become its conclusion. Still, the hills retained their quiet authority. When something was found out of place, an abandoned camp, a bundle of cloth, a tool left too carefully, people responded with the same calm caution that had once defined the worst years. They did not panic. They did not accuse. They waited. Because whatever had once been done in the Missouri Ozarks had not required witnesses to remain effective. It had required only that men learn how easily order could be imposed, and how completely it could erase its own tracks. The final echoes of the case surfaced not through crime but through avoidance. By the late 1920s, certain habits had become so ingrained that no one remembered adopting them. New trappers were advised, without explanation, to avoid particular hollows in winter. Timber crews adjusted routes instinctively, skirting places that offered no resistance, yet no welcome either. In 1929, a conservation officer named Edgar Holcomb filed a brief report after spending several nights surveying wildlife patterns near the upper ridges. He noted a persistent absence of animal activity in one narrow corridor, despite abundant forage and water. His explanation was environmental. A handwritten note added later by another officer read, "Long-standing condition." That winter, a transient laborer disappeared while moving between camps. His belongings were found arranged beside the trail, blanket folded, tin cup rinsed, boots set neatly heel to heel. The sheriff ruled exposure. No search followed. The arrangement was familiar enough that no one pressed the matter. What unsettled those who noticed was not the disappearance itself, but the restraint. There were no signs of struggle, no panic in the placement of objects. It resembled older scenes too closely to be coincidence, yet differed just enough to defy certainty. No hides surfaced. No tools were found. If a method still existed, it had evolved beyond recognition. A retired judge, reflecting on the case in a private letter, wrote, "Whatever man once stood at the center of this is no longer necessary. The conditions he relied upon have been absorbed." He did not specify what those conditions were. By the early 1930s, the Ozarks no longer produced stories like rooks. The land was busier, watched, and mapped. Isolation, the essential ingredient, had become scarce. And yet, when winter fell heavy and sound traveled poorly through the trees, older residents still felt a subtle vigilance return. They checked camps. They accounted for men. They avoided solitude longer than needed, not because they feared a trapper, but because they remembered a time when someone had proven how little fear was required to make a man disappear. The Missouri Ozarks did not preserve the case as history. They preserved it as practice. And practice, once learned, does not need repetition to remain effective. By the mid-1930s, the rook matter had reached the far edge of what could still be called memory. Those who had lived through the worst years were gone or silent. Those who remained knew the story only through behaviors passed down without explanation, rules taught as instinct rather than warning. In 1934, a Works Progress Administration surveyor cataloging local oral histories recorded a brief exchange with an elderly man near the Jacks Fork River. When asked about unusual disappearances in the area, the man replied, "Not disappearances, reductions." The word was underlined twice in the transcript, then left without comment. That same year, a flood cut deeply into a limestone bank upstream, exposing layers of earth long undisturbed. Children found scraps of oilcloth tangled in roots. An adult arrived before they could dig further and ordered the site filled. The explanation given was erosion. No report followed. A county clerk nearing retirement wrote one final marginal note in the old file after reviewing it for disposal. "This was not a crime of passion," he wrote. "It was a craft." The note was unsigned. By then, even speculation had thinned. There were no more sightings, no new patterns. If Isaac Rook had survived into old age, he left no trace of it. If he had died earlier, his end went as unnoticed as his movements had once been. Either possibility fit too well to argue. What remained undeniable was effect. The Ozarks had learned to deny opportunity, to crowd the spaces where isolation once flourished. Roads, camps, and patrols filled the silence that had once allowed careful work to proceed undisturbed. And yet, in the quietest seasons, the land still hinted at its older capacity. Hunters reported hollows where sound flattened and distance misjudged itself. Campfires burned strangely low. Men woke with the sense that something had already passed through while they slept. Nothing was ever found. Nothing needed to be. The method, whatever it had been, no longer required action. Its lesson had been absorbed completely. And in the Missouri Ozarks, where the forest had once permitted a man to be reduced to hide, silence, and order, the ground held steady, waiting not for return, but for acknowledgement that some things, once done properly, never need to be done again. The last reference appears where no one expected it, inside a routine maintenance ledger from 1939, kept by a county road crew tasked with clearing fallen timber after a winter storm. The entry lists dates, locations, and hours worked. Then, beside one narrow hollow near the upper forks, a single line breaks the pattern. No clearing required. Area already settled. There is no explanation. No initials. The phrase is not used anywhere else in the book. By that point, nearly 50 years had passed since Isaac Rook first appeared along the rivers and ridges of the Missouri Ozarks. The people who had known his name were gone. The file that once held affidavits and cautions had been reduced to a box few remembered requesting. And yet, the ground still carried instructions. Older residents continued to notice small things. How snow melted unevenly in certain corridors. How sound traveled poorly in particular hollows. How animals skirted places that looked by every measure suitable. These observations were shared without emphasis, as if reporting weather. No one suggested cause. A retired ranger interviewed briefly before his death summarized it best. "The hills learned," he said, "once was enough." He refused to say what they had learned. No effort was made to reopen the case. There was nothing left to pursue, no suspect, no evidence that could survive scrutiny, no community appetite for dissection. The law requires clarity. This story had survived precisely because it offered none. The Ozarks moved forward, not cleansed, not haunted, but adjusted. The roots that once allowed a solitary trapper to work with precision were no longer empty. The silence he had relied upon had been filled with traffic, industry, and shared presence. If a method had existed, it no longer fit the land. Still, the echo remained. Not in rumors or sightings, but in restraint, in the way men accounted for one another, in the way camps were left marked, in the way certain places were passed without comment. The legacy was not fear, it was behavior. And so the disturbing tale of the trapper with human pelts did not end with a confession or a grave. It ended the way some cases do in the Missouri Ozarks, by becoming unnecessary. Whatever had once moved through those forests had finished its work quietly and left no need to return. The mountains kept that knowledge without recording it, without correcting it, without demanding belief. They simply held it. And on certain winter mornings, when the woods stand still and the hollows feel complete, people there still sense that something was done once, carefully, deliberately, and that the land remembers exactly how.